I told Cheryl she's going to pinch in for me next week. Uh, I'm not good teaching children on when I in the best of times, not especially not when I'm sleep deprived. Um, but learning to function, so it's good. For those that are visiting, I have a newborn at home that's 3 weeks old, and so if I look disheveled, it's because I am. And this is not actually, no, I kind of look like this all the time. Um, Last week, we began the series on Advent. And Advent is a time of expectation. The Jews, for hundreds of years, did not hear a word from God, and they were just faithfully going about their lives, listening for God's voice, watching for God's presence to return, and they're anticipating. And the Christians, as we came to know Christ, Christ left and he said, I'm coming back, I will return. And so we continue to live in a time of expectation that Christ has come to set us free and Christ has come to redeem a broken world, but he's coming back to make that fully known. And so the early Christians in the early centuries of the church started creating a calendar and a rhythm of life together. And the year of the Christian life began with Advent. And it was begun with Advent to say, we need to remember that we're in a time of expectation. We have not arrived yet. We are not fully in the presence of God, but we wait for it patiently. Because we have compulsions to try and be God in this world and to try and do what we think God wants to happen in this world. Advent is a time of stepping back and saying, well, what is it that God is doing? And what is our hope in what Christ has done? Last week we talked about hope. That the world without hope, the world of violence, the world of anger, the world of chaos, has a shortness of breath and a shallowness of breath and a quickness of breath that leaves the world anxious. But as people of hope, we know what God is doing, what God has done, and what God will do in this world. And because of that hope, we can breathe deeply. And this is the Spirit of God, the breath of God that we breathe in, and we are calm because we are people of hope. And we talked about being people of hope. We create a soil, we cultivate the soil of our lives, and out of that soil grows peace, joy, and love. That to know someone who has hope, to know that someone is living out of the reality of the hope they have in God, you will see that they are people of peace, not just people at peace, but people who pursue peace and people that create peace in the world. That you'll see that there are people of joy, not of shallow happiness when circumstances are good, but people of joy who can look at things and find the way that God is working no matter how hard the circumstances, and they can be people of joy. And finally, they can be people of love. That no matter what you do to me, I can love you nonetheless. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter what you've done, I can be a person of love because my hope is in what God is already doing in the world. And so it doesn't matter what you do, I have a responsibility to love. And so Advent is a time that reminds us that as people of hope, we live out that hope in these profound ways that as we look at Jesus coming into the world, and we celebrate the presence of God coming into the world, we see hope, peace, joy, and love coming into the world to transform the world, to redeem it back to God. And so we are people of peace. And I want to look at this passage in Romans chapter 12 that Alex read for us earlier and that we've meditated on. And I want to spend just a little bit of time in it, and I'm going to resist the urge to really unpack this passage because this passage has so much to say to us, but I really want to focus on what it says about peace. In the first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul's addressing all of these issues of Jews and Gentiles coming together in the faith. And what does it mean for Jew and Gentile to come together as one body? And he's addressing all these issues of what it means to be justified by faith. And is it by our faith or is it the faith of Jesus? And he's wrestling with all this stuff. But he finally gets to chapter 12 and he says, therefore. And he's talking about what it means to be a community that comes together in Christ. And he says, therefore, this is how you are to live. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, my family, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. In this section of chapter 12, and we put the chapters there later, but in this section that Paul's writing, he actually frames it up with verse 2 and verse 21. And everything he says is framed by these two verses. I'm going to read verse 2 again, and then I'll read verse 21. Verse 2 says, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And then he ends this section with this, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And when we look at the world and how it functions, it's a world of might means right. It's a world of the victors write the history. It's a world of chaos. And if you're not the boot, you're under the boot. And if that's how the world works, because if you're under the boot, you need to work hard to become the boot. Because if you're not oppressed, you're oppressing someone. And the world says you need to rise up to put them down so that you can be in control and you can be in power. And Paul begins this section with, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And as we look at what it means to be people of peace, I want to look at three areas. First, you have to be a person at peace, and you have to recognize where your peace comes from. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. Who knows it? While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I'm pretending everybody said it behind your masks. It's really hard to hear between the AC and your mask, and that's okay. But while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I think it's Romans 3:23 where it talks about the faithfulness of Christ, and there's a debate here on the translation. Is it the faith in Christ or faithfulness of Christ? I think it's the faithfulness of Christ, because even my faith falls short of bringing me into relationship with God. It is Christ's faithfulness that transforms me, and it's my submission to his faithfulness. That what we do when we are still powerless, when we are still rotten, when we are still dirty, when we are still ruined, when did God act on your behalf to bring you to peace with him? In your darkest moments, in your worst versions of who you are, Christ died for you. So how do you come to peace with God? How do you come to peace with yourself? And how do you come to peace with everybody else in this world? It first starts with recognizing peace comes first and foremost from God through Jesus into your life. If you're not at peace with yourself, it's going to be hard to accept that you're at peace with God. You have to start with recognizing that God has brought you to a place of peace to then be at peace with yourself. You can't do anything to make God love you more. And you can't do anything to make God love you less. There's nothing you can do to come to peace with God. God has done it for you. And so, therefore, how are you to live at peace with one another? And the second place we look to peace is we actually come together as a church to be at peace with one another. Because God has brought me to peace with him, I now come to peace with you no matter who you are, what you've done, and where you've come from. I can have peace with you because God has made peace with me. God has made it possible for me to have peace with him. Jesus died so that we could be at peace together. Well, let me give some context to this in Romans. Emperor Claudius was the emperor of Rome at the time that this was written. And there's a church already established in Rome when Paul got there. And so Paul's actually writing to a church that he didn't establish. And in 41 AD, I won't get into all the history, but Claudius kicked all of the Jews out of Rome. He just decided one day, Jews are no longer welcome here. So I want you to think about this context for a minute. When the church started, it was started by Jews, and it was Jews who began following the Messiah. And so the church looked Jewish, it acted Jewish, it followed Torah. And then Peter goes to Cornelius' house. This is the book of Acts. And there's this struggle of what does it mean for a Gentile to now be a follower of Christ? And they have to figure out, do they have to follow Torah? Or do they not have to follow Torah? What is it that a non-Jew has to do now that they follow Christ? But the Jews continued to follow Torah. They continued to be good Jews as followers of Christ. And so I want you to think about the awkwardness of the church and the tension in the church between Jews and non-Jews. Jews were taught about Christ first. And so you have a predominantly Jewish church that now Gentiles come into. You have a church potluck. Everybody bring a dish. Someone brings ham sandwiches. Whoops. The Jews don't eat ham. The Gentiles do. And so they have this tension between them. And this is a minor thing. You can get into circumcision and all the other stuff. But they have different customs, different ways of living. And the Jews, who are in the majority, are going to feel this compulsion to say, you need to be like us if you want to follow Christ. This is the ways of the world. This is a unique situation in Rome because what happens in 41 AD? The Jews are kicked out of Rome. Whose church is it now? It's the Gentiles' church. There's no Jews left. And after 9 years, the Jews are actually welcomed back into Rome. And the Jews come back to Rome, and the Christian Jews come back to Rome, and they come back to church. And whose church is it? Is it a Jewish church or a Gentile church? It's a church of Christ. Okay, thank you. But the reality is, for 9 years, the Gentiles, they developed their own way of doing things. They developed their own practices. They have a potluck. There's a ham in the middle of it. They're eating a burger with cheese. You know, there's Levitical laws there that they're breaking. But it's one of those things that they say, okay, Paul says, live at peace with everyone. As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And what we have the tendency to do is, I offer you peace, Gentiles, as long as you follow Torah. If you don't follow Torah, we're not going to be at peace. But I extend peace to you. And then the Jews, they say, well, I extend peace to you, Gentiles. Um, I, yeah, I'm mixing them up because I'm tired. But yeah, the Gentiles are saying, you need to become more Roman because we've obviously are the high point of society. We've figured out how the world should work. So you need to let go of some of those legalistic Torah observances. Y'all need to grow up a little bit. And when you do, we can be at peace. And we don't look at this so much in our churches because, frankly, in our churches, we tend to say, okay, the Asian Christians, they can congregate over here. The Hispanic church can congregate over here. The black church over here. The white church over here. And we allow churches to be in different places. And it's almost like we take the salad bowl of Christianity and we just put all the ingredients in different bowls. And we say, whichever ingredient you like, you can go eat of that ingredient. But then sometimes we say diversity is something we like and something we crave, and so we put all the ingredients into one bowl and then we dump as much ranch dressing on it as possible so that every bite you taste tastes like what? Ranch dressing. And we cover over diversity with this kind of uniformity that completely obliterates the uniqueness of each flavor. When Paul calls the church to come to table together, this is the point of Galatians, this is the point of Romans. He's calling them to come together around the same table to celebrate the diversity that is the church. To continue the salad metaphor, I've become a little bit more of a salad eater myself, thanks to my wife. But you put a little bit of olive oil on it, extra virgin olive oil, because it then enhances the flavors of each of the parts of the salad. And each flavor begins to complement other flavors. It's not that you ask someone to stop being the culture and the background from which they come, but you see the goodness that comes to the table and how it enhances the church. But what we tend to do is say, we really enjoy diversity, but you need to cover yourself in ranch dressing. And so what Paul is calling them to is don't be conformed to the ways of this world that looks at power structures and says, okay, we're in charge now. We've been doing this for 9 years. You can come as long as you give up your Torah observance. Or this was our church. It was our Messiah who died for it. You need to follow these ways of doing things. And so every culture that Paul went into, he said, what does it look like for people to live at peace together? Because the world is chaos and it needs an example of what peace looks like. And so the church comes together and says, let's figure out how to love one another and to be at peace with one another as far as it depends on me so that we can love one another and show the world what it's supposed to look like. It's a challenge to the church to bring different people together. And frankly, it's a lot easier to be in a church where people think and act just like me. I'm thankful that we're in a church where Republicans and Democrats can come together. And I'm thankful that we're in a church where different cultural groups can come together. And I'm thankful that we can be a church of peace as an example to a world of chaos. And I think we do a good job at this in so many ways, and we have so far to go because we don't have many examples of what it looks like to be people of peace. Because we would rather say, I don't like what you just said. Actually, it's more of I don't like what I assume you just said. Because we never take the opportunity to hear each other out. Because all of our hope and all of our peace is dependent on ourselves rather than God. And so peace invites each of us to the table and say, let me hear you. What you just said rubbed me differently. Can I understand better what you're saying? That's what a church of peace looks like, to celebrate the diversity. And so Paul calls us to be people of peace. And I'm going to read this last part of this passage twice, because it also determines how we live at peace with those around us. Starting in verse 14, it says, "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people in low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." So I want to stop there real quick. Whose responsibility is it to be at peace? It's Donald's responsibility. Good. I'm glad someone volunteered. No, it is my responsibility. I was like, well, but you don't know what they did. It's my responsibility. Paul is giving a charge. It is up to you, no strings attached, to live at peace with everyone. It says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." When it comes to the church, the way this is written is a little bit, it's hard for us to swallow because it's talking about enemies. I don't consider any of you enemies. I don't like some of you. Okay, that got some of your attention. I love all of you. I don't like some of the things you believe in, but I don't consider you an enemy. I don't like some of the things you post on Facebook, but do I consider you an enemy? Okay, are y'all following me a little bit? We tend to dismiss passages like this because we think, oh, well, our enemies are over in the Middle East. Let's be honest with ourselves. And they're so far away that we don't actually have to really think about them at all. But the tension I feel in my body when I see you acting a certain way tells me that that's the Spirit's guidance in saying I need to be proactive in hospitality and love so that we may be at peace. Or so often we silo ourselves out into different camps, and then we come together and cover ourselves with ranch dressing and pretend that all is well. It is up to you to live at peace with everyone. How do you pursue peace? You do it, and I'm going to end on this section with this. You pursue peace with everyone by entering into intentional relationships. I'm not saying you enter into relationships where it's like, okay, let's talk about our differences. Enter into genuine, sincerely loved relationships where you focus on the things you do have in common. And as you focus on the things you do have in common, Jesus Christ, who brought you into peace with God, as you focus on the things you do have in common, the things that are different start to get celebrated. But what we tend to do, and what the world really tells us to do, is focus on the differences. We got 99 things that are similar, and we want to focus on the one thing that's different. And it causes divisions. So let's be a church that comes together and builds relationships. And we're going to focus more on that next year. How do you build relationships with people that are genuine? And mostly it's through serving together. So I want to end with this last section. To be people of peace doesn't mean you're just in a feeling of peacefulness in a world of chaos, but as Jesus prayed, as Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, those who seek peace and bring peace into the world." they are blessed. That peace is actually a proactive thing that we engage in because we are people of God. We don't, when it says love must be sincere, we don't love better than the world. We love wholly differently from the world because the example of love that we have is this, that we celebrate every Sunday. Jesus' death on the cross. And if God can meet me where I am, in my brokenness, in my darkness, in my sinfulness, to bring me to peace with Him, I can meet the world where they are in their brokenness, in their darkness, and I can bring and be peace for them. This was written to a church that was actually persecuted. And when I say actually persecuted, I mean like killed. Their businesses were shut down. They were ostracized in society for being Christ followers. And Paul says this, do not repay evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And this is saying that there's a cycle that this world has engaged in. It's the cycle of revenge. That you've done something to me, therefore I retaliate and do something to you, but I went a little bit far in how I retaliated, so now you feel justified to seek revenge on what I've done, and now that you've done this to me, I seek revenge back on you. Do you see the cycle in the world? It's been going on in the Middle East between tribes and peoples for thousands of years. The northern, the Irish in Northern Ireland have been fighting each other over who's Protestant and who's Catholic. They worship the same Jesus, and they're fighting over who's right. They're fighting over British rule. They're fighting over, and it's become a cycle of revenge. We can all think of families that have been fighting. When you get into like small town politics, families have hated each other for generations. And what Paul is saying here is, as people who have hope, as people who live within the peace of Christ, we see the world differently. And we break the cycle of revenge because we believe that God is going to bring redemption. It's not ours to bring revenge. And how does this play out in every aspect of your life? What if someone tries to kill you? To live is Christ, to die is gain. You can't take anything from me. But we live in a world that says, let's kill each other over stuff. Your life is not nearly as important as my things. And this is hard for us to swallow, but we have to think about what does it mean to be peacemakers. But first, you got to be at peace here. You got to be at peace with God to then be at peace with the world and let go of your desire for revenge. I want to give a quick disclaimer here that this part where it says in verse 20, in doing this you will heap burning coals on his head. I have heard people quote this to say, if you want to really get them, be good to them because God's going to turn up the heat. That's not what this says. The context, the life of Christ is one of reconciliation and redemption. That if your whole reason for doing good to someone else is so that they burn in hell all the hotter, you are wrong and you don't have the mind of Christ because you don't want what's best for them. What this passage is saying is in the sincerity of love that you have in Christ, seek reconciliation, because the only way you're going to be reconciled is not through hitting harder, but through loving harder. And when you turn the heat up on them, it's hard to keep beating someone who's loving you back. The world doesn't act this way. And it desperately needs examples of what it looks like to live in this kind of love. And so I want to stop. I want to share one example that it moves me to tears every time I read this story. Back in 2006, 2007, up in Pennsylvania, there was an Amish community. I'm looking around to see what kids we have. Okay, so our kids are gone. A man who is close to the Amish community went into the one-room schoolhouse, bound up the girls, and started killing them. He killed 5 and injured 5 others, and then killed himself. What does it look like to be people of peace in that kind of hatred and anger, in that kind of chaos? And it's the Amish community that has taught us and given us an example of what it means to be people of peace. Still hurting. Being people of peace does not mean you ignore the hurt in the world and the hurt that's been caused to you. But I was reading an interview with the mother of the shooter, who, when they had a private funeral for the shooter, because they're still hurting because of their son, when they had a private funeral for him, 40 of the Amish showed up to the funeral to pray for his soul, not that it be damned, mind you, to pray for his soul that God would receive him. Because his level of brokenness that has caused him to do what he's done needs to be redeemed. And they also were there to support the family who just lost their husband, who just lost their dad, and who just lost their son. And they extended forgiveness to the family. When the world surrounded the Amish community and poured money into that Amish community, they just said, we don't need this money. And they gave it to the family who just lost their breadwinner and who just lost their provider. And they provided money for their shooter. The mother of the shooter, her name's Terry. 10 years later, she was reflecting back on this. When she showed up at her house, she said, I can't face my Amish neighbors anymore. I can't even look at them for the atrocities that my son has committed. And when she showed up to the funeral and the Amish embraced her and offered forgiveness, it changed her heart. And she actually spent the next 10 years caring for one of the victims who was injured the worst, who was wheelchair bound and had a feeding tube the rest of her life. She spent the next 10 years taking care of that child. And the father of that child said, while we wish that none of this would have happened to us, we praise God for the relationship that we have together because of this situation. And when you look at that kind of mindset of peace, and when the Amish are asked, why did they respond the way they did? They said, because Jesus offers peace to me through the cross. Who am I to reject offering peace to someone else? If Christ can forgive me, how can I not forgive? And when you see embodiments of this kind of forgiveness that comes from being at peace with God, you have hope that what Jesus called us to be as peacemakers can transform the world. So, church, I want to ask us, what does it look like to be at peace with God and to seek peace with God, peace in yourself, that is then lived out and practiced in peace in this community with one another, so that we can then go and be peace to the world, no matter what their doctrine is, no matter what their worldview is, no matter what their identity issues are, that we can go and be peace with them and for them. And no matter what happens to us, we respond naturally with love and forgiveness and peace, because we already have hope. I pray that we become a people that celebrate and live out peace. The message is yours, church.